Okay, good afternoon everyone. I hope you're all refreshed after lunch. So my name is John Dollery. I'm the Mapping Officer at the Royal Commission for the Historical Monuments of Wales, and I'll be leading you through this afternoon and introducing our speakers. I've been asked to ask a few mentions that may not have been picked up this morning. So as some of you may know, there's been a change to the timetable as one of our speakers wasn't able to contribute today, Sonia. So this afternoon we'll only have 2 talks. And also to remind people that as you go this afternoon and after the conference, we've also got the National Library shop, and please do go have a look and have a browse at some of the fantastic things the National Library have got for sale there. So this afternoon we've got 2 talks. Our first talk is going to be by Marian Gwyn, or Dr. Marian Gwyn, from Bangor University. So Marian is a historian and a heritage consultant. And this afternoon, she's going to talk to us about mapping power and the links that Wales, uncomfortable links Wales has with the transatlantic slave trade. So I will hand over to Marian. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr am y gwahoddiad I siarad yma heddiw. Now, I am not an artist, and so I've been thrown in as a ringer for this afternoon, and so the way that I'm going to be talking about maps is a very different way to the way that you've heard this morning. And I must say, I've just blown over by the talks this morning. It has really changed the way that I will look at maps for the rest of my life. So thank you so much to whoever put this amazing programme together. Now, I'm talking about I'm a historian, and so most of what I'm going to be talking about is from a historical perspective. Now, I am here representing Bangor University today, and has already been said, and something that I will be asking for your help for later on is the pressure that has been, immense pressure that has just been put on Bangor University Archive. And without access to that archive, very little of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about today would actually be available. But on the plus side of this, so obviously this has nothing to do with the decision that has been made by Bangor University, is that Bangor Archives was successful in getting a grant from the Welsh Government to digitise many of the Jamaica plantation maps that I'm going to be talking about today, and they are available free for you to look at online, and I'll be talking to you a little bit more about that in a minute. It is a remarkable collection, but one thing I want to talk about when we see maps like this, and something that Jasmine alluded to during her talk, they can seem empty. They don't show the people. And so what I hope to do today is not only explore these maps as objects, but also give you a little bit of insight, try to reclaim some of the voices of the people that contributed to the enormous wealth that were made by the pennants and, of course, many others in the Caribbean. And that is, of course, because these maps are absolutely inseparable from the absolutely brutal history of the Atlantic trade in enslaved people. And so before looking at the maps, I think we need a little reminder of what underpins all of this. So before we start looking at the maps, let's have a look at a map. This is Herman Moll's wonderful map of the Caribbean, done in 1715. And this was the world that had been basically created economically by the Spanish. It was a very brutal world, a very opportunistic world, a world that you could make enormous wealth or lose your life very quickly. The Spanish, of course, held most of the Main. We hear about the Spanish Main. That was the Ring of Maine land that you see around the Caribbean there. And then Britain was messing around in Virginia, that you can see at the top in the amber colour there, as well as other parts of North America. England took St. Kitts and Barbados in the 1620s, and then it was in 1655 under Oliver Cromwell that we took Jamaica, which is there, just under Cuba there. The English, there's plenty Welsh people, Iwan, plenty Welsh people, I assure you.
That's the whole story.
Although, I've forgotten his name. Planet. Who started Planet? Ned Thomas, he actually said no Welshman took part in Empire. And of course, when he was challenged on this, he said, yes, okay, but they weren't Welsh when they did it. So, and so it is with that in mind that we continue. But yes, good point, Ewan. But it is a we. It is, I assure you, it is a we. And this map I absolutely adore because this is basically a plan to perfect piracy. Because if you have a look at those little lines that are coming through the sea, he's actually mapped the flotilla routes of the Spanish fleets when they were coming back loaded with silver and gold, so that British ships and other European ships could actually hide out in the right places so they could nab them at the right time. Everybody else had pirates, we had merchant adventurers, of course. Okay. But this was a world, very brutal world, built on slavery. And this is William Clark's painting of Antigua Plantation in 1823. One thing, of course, they did not look like was like this. But it was a world that was totally built on slavery. And when we're looking at historical documents, we're going to be seeing words and phrases that are absolutely untenable to us now. But to understand the historical record, we do need to explore them. Now, 70% of the enslaved that went to the Caribbean worked on sugar plantations, and it was the biggest killer of all enslaved occupations. They were literally worked to death. The second biggest killer was mercury and silver mining in South America, and the third biggest killer was enforced prostitution. But the biggest killer of all was sugar plantations. The average life expectancy of an enslaved African on the plantations was mid-20s. Very, very short indeed, short and brutal life. And of course, this is now what a modern cane cutting enterprise looks at. 50% of cane cut now is still cut by hand. It's very difficult to cut by machine. Very, very brutal, very, very hard, and there's no record of the enslaved on the Caribbean plantations, the pennon plantations included, ever being given any footwear. And the amount of diseases and problems they had with their feet because of this was just astounding. And so when we look at these maps, we must forever keep these memories as to what led to the creation of a map like this. And just to we talk about it being a big killer, and just to remind ourselves of what the figures are actually like. And by 1790, and if you think the slave trade didn't come to an end until 1807, and then slavery itself until the 1830s, so the numbers would have got higher, Jamaica imported 1,230,000 Africans to raise the enslaved population to 387,000. The death rate was absolutely phenomenal. During the entire time of slavery, the African population, the black population, never mind maintained its numbers, just didn't increase. The death rate was so high. If you look at during the time of the 350, 400 years of slavery, it's estimated that 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic to what was called the New World, not new to the people who lived there, of course. But 5% went to North America, about 35 to 40% went to South America, and between 55 and 60% went to the Caribbean. Why so many to such a small place of land? Tiny little islands. It's because the death rates were so high, they were worked to death. And so when we look at these statistics, just remember. And so we have to separate our understanding of what North America was like compared to the Caribbean. We think of Roots, 12 Years a Slave, Django Unchained, and all of those. No, they're totally different. The foundation was the same, but the way that they were worked, yes, American slavery was very, very cruel, but the death rate was not so high. They did not kill them in the same rate that the Caribbean did. And so you get from just 5% African Americans have grown from that small amount. But it wasn't until after the abolition of slavery that you get an increase in the number of the black community in the Caribbean. In America, in North America, people went as families they established roads, schools, universities, they established cultures. In the Caribbean, that didn't happen. In Jamaica, they just think of them as oil rigs. They were just there to pump out sugar, pump out money. They were never self-sufficient. Anything the islands needed was always shipped in. And if you think the families, they were called settlers in North America. In the Caribbean, they were always just called planters. The average age of people, and it was typically young men, about 70% of young men around the age of 35 who would go try to make the money quickly and get out. It was a totally different life. It was horrible for the whites and just utterly appalling for the black population. And it was really interesting listening to Yuan's talk this morning, and he was absolutely right when he was talking about the Mappa Mundi, where you have the maps that showed the coast in great detail, because that's what imperial maps did, or trading maps to start with, and then imperial maps. They wanted to show the coastline to help sea captains get there okay, and they helped, for example, in this case Jamaica, the Crown make decisions regarding governance, infrastructure, decisions like that. What you don't necessarily get is details on the interior, because there's a massive difference between a print map and a manuscript map. Print maps were readily available, or more readily available, and so this would be a print map. So they didn't want to give your enemy or your competitor any more information that was absolutely needed. And so you just tend to get the coast and very little information on what's on the inside. So this is Jamaica. It's about 150 miles long, 50 miles wide, which theoretically means that there isn't a part of Jamaica that isn't more than 25 miles from the sea. That's as a bird flies. Jamaica is really, really mountainous, and so you can at least double that if you want to get from the centre down to the sea. Very, very mountainous. Several of the mountains are twice as high as Snowdon, which makes it visually beautiful, but very, very difficult to actually, if you wanted to get products out, which we shall see how they did that later. So a absolutely fascinating place. So looking at a map like this, what does it tell us about the estates? They are marked on it, you just can't see them. And let's just have a little bit of a close-up here. And can you see all those dots? That's the centre of the plantations. They don't tell you anything else. And this is where the estate maps are absolutely critical, because there was no other mapping at this time of the centre of Jamaica, which is why if we could get all the estate maps of Jamaica and fit them together like a big jigsaw, we might have an idea of what the centre of Jamaica was actually like at this time. Now, the all bar one of the pennant plantations are on that map there, but you just have no idea where they are. So let's have a look now. So they're in those circles there. I'm not going to be looking at Kings Valley, the one in the green circle today. That's in the Montego Bay area there. That's in Westmoreland. I'm going to be looking at those in the blue circles and the red circles. Now, the blue circles, I'm concentrating more. When I mention pennants, it's basically all of those in that area, okay? All the plantations all abut together. If you look at them on a map, it looks as if it is one plantation, but it's actually, they're all separated out. And so you've got pennants that covers Cave River, Cupids, as if it's got a T, Cupids, and the name Pennant and Thomas River is interchangeable in the record, but it's the same plantation. That's mountainous, very high, very challenging to get to. And then on the lowlands, you've got Denbigh. And Denbigh, yes, Welsh name, Bullard's Pen, Coates Pen, Denbigh itself, and Main Savannah. And as I say, they all abut together. So what's the difference in the name? We mentioned estates. This is about estates maps. Most large plantations were called estates, like we called them landed estates here. A plantation was a smaller plantation, but over the years, we tend to talk about estates as in what's in Britain and plantations, what's in the colonial areas. So I'm going to stick mostly to plantations, but when I talk about estates as well, I'm referring to these. So what is a pen? A pen is basically for livestock. It's like a home farm in a way. It's what kept the plantation going. They needed a lot of livestock, and so a pen was what was used there. So you would always get a large plantation would always have a pen associated with it. But Coates is down on most of the documents as a pen, but it worked as a plantation as well, because it did actually grow sugar. Now, I mentioned earlier on how difficult the lifestyle was for everybody there. And so what most people did is, especially those who went there earlier on, those who went out early became very big very early and got out as soon as they could. The lifestyle was horrific. Alcoholism was on off the scale because the lifestyle was so appalling there. And so they would get out as soon as possible, leaving their estates under the care of what they called agents, attorneys, bookkeepers, not what we would call bookkeepers. They're all the same role. Those are basically land agents. And so they would manage the plantations, while the rich guys would be in London, buying their landed estates all over the country, like the Penrhyn estate, and living it up. What that meant was that it actually extracted the profits from Jamaica to Britain. And so the money that was spent in Jamaica was just enough to keep the plantations going, not enough to actually invest in the sorts of structures that were going on in North America. But what this means, once they became absentees, it meant we had a lot of letters. And so we actually find out what they're thinking about what they're doing, because they're writing letters backwards and forwards between their agents and between them. And so there's quite a large body of information here. And these are some of the letters that are held in Bangor University archives. There's some letters, there's some land deed polls from 1671 there, and here is a list of enslaved people with their prices. And there's Cyrus, there's Cuffy, there's Dido, Fidelity, Candice, Juba, Martha, Cujo, Mary, Grace, and so many others. It's a mix of African names and a mix of European names. And it's very salutary indeed when you're looking at the reality of what these documents actually show. We also have, along with these documents, we also have paintings. Now, there's two paintings, one of Pennant, one of Denbigh, and they hang on the walls of Penrhyn Castle. They're just copies now, and the original are with the family. And again, it did not look like this, absolutely did not look like this. This is very sanitized. Now, these two paintings were painted in 1870, so well after the period of enslavement, but even then it would not have looked like this. So this is Denbigh, very flat, low mountains in the background, okay? And this is Pennant, high up in the mountains. You can see already the landscape is changing behind. Even though this is heavily anesthetized, looks so twee, so clean, you can still see the difference in the landscape. Now, one thing I want you to I think notice, you'll have seen it in Denbigh, you see it here now, just how industrial these sites were. Because if you have a look there, these are heavy industrial sites. And one of the reasons why Jamaica was able to make so much money in the 18th century was that it industrialized very quickly. We think of the Industrial Revolution in Britain as the end of the 19th century, or, coming up, especially that's when the big factories started coming up. Here, they were industrializing from the end of the 1600s. And they were having everything that we think of a capitalist system, a lot of capital investment, separation of owner from site of production. You've got specialized, and don't talk about Henry Ford, these got it. So separation of skills and tasks was already in place. And the average plantation at the beginning of the 1700s would have 150 enslaved workers on it. You don't get anywhere near that number of industrialized workers in the British Industrial Revolution in the north of England until the end of the 19th century. These were hugely industrial sites from very, very early on. And say, for example, in Louisiana, only 5% of estates had anything anywhere near a figure like that. It was just the Caribbean. Now, I just want to point out a couple of things, because I will be referring to them when we look at the maps. Can you see over there on which is it to you? It's your right, isn't it? The right there, that looks like a hut. That is actually the Great House. Okay, so the great house is on the hill looking down, and where this guy with his horse is, there is a ford. That's Thomas River. He's going through a ford, and there's the works behind him. Okay, so when we look now at the plantation maps, we get a whole range of different maps. And I think it's good for us to not only look at them as objects, but also to explore what can we find out about the people that were behind the creation of these maps. They are, as far as maps go, they're pretty typical of plantation maps, where you get a variety from sketches, mid-range maps, to really, really sophisticated, what you might call, cadastral estate maps used for taxation purposes. So this is just a sketch, and this would have appeared in a letter written by the agent, so probably just sketched by the agent himself. But what's interesting at this, he does actually make reference to one of the first maps that were drawn of Penrhyn Estate, Penrhyn Denbigh Estate, going back to 1669, so very, very early indeed. So, of course, establishing ownership was incredibly important, and I'll be going a little bit into that. And so we move on from something as simple as this to this is still a very simple map here. And this is of Penrhyn, that woodland one. But if you have a look, the compass is very, very simple. There's no cartouche here. There is colour, and there is a scale at the bottom. The typical scale for these maps was 10 chains to 1 inch. A chain, we don't use that measurement anymore, but it's 22 yards, so just over 20 metres. So that was they did vary, but a typical one would be 10 chains to the inch. But that one is actually really interesting. But just have a look at these images in pink at the bottom. You see where the buildings are. On the right side of the river, that is the great house. You can see the ford, and then the works are there in pink. One thing you do not get on these maps ever are contour lines, elevation. So without that painting, you would not know that the great house was raised up on the hill. That's why we need the artworks to actually help us put these images into perspective. They hardly ever any contour lines, and they hardly ever you hardly ever see latitude, longitude. And in fact, James Robinson, who was the most famous Scottish surveyor of Jamaica, used to complain, saying he was the only surveyor in Jamaica who ever knew where the meridian was. So I don't know how accurate it was, but there was a great deal of controversy how accurate some of these maps actually were. And then to something that is slightly, again, I'm using maps of Penrhyn just to show the variation of maps that you actually get if we're looking at, I think, artistic ability. But if you have a look here, this is again Penrhyn's. As you can see, you've got the Great House, the ford, and the works down the bottom there. But have a look at the difference here now. You've got a very, very smart-looking compass at the top there, and a beautiful cartouche here. Now, so much so, they actually looked as they've been... most of the maps that I'm looking at are about 1750 to the 1780s. That's basically the area that I'm looking at. They actually look as if they've been stamped, but during this period they absolutely weren't. The surveyors were very proud of their draftsmanship, and they took a great deal of pride in producing original cartouches and original symbols on their maps. But you can tell that this map has been produced by different hands, because while the cartouches and the compass may well have been produced by a skilled draftsman, the map certainly wasn't. It's a very simply drawn map. As you can see, there's colour here. But if you have a look at the artistry involved in it, it's clearly drawn by somebody totally incapable of drawing a curve without a ruler. It's just they've just moved the ruler a little bit further along. And then you get, of course, the big, what we might call the big, massive estate maps, cadastral maps that were produced for taxation purposes. A copy of these would all have to be registered with the authorities for taxation purposes. Now, while this may look like a typical British estate map, and in many ways it is, in many ways it absolutely is not, because there are several things missing that you do not get in Jamaica that are very evident when you look at a British estate map. Because if you look at British estate maps, they show you such a palimpsest of history of common land, access, pastures, pathways. You get none of that here. There's no common land. There's no access for a small landowner to take their cattle to pasture or sheep up to their cynefin at the top of the mountain. This is all, and there are no what we would call enclosure maps. This is all enclosure. This is all enclosure. And that is a big, big difference when you look at these maps. And it's something that really, and if you think this is a map of, it says at the top, a plan of Denby, very beautifully done. John Schickel was the agent, and Thomas Binshall was the surveyor. He wasn't an official surveyor, he was actually an overseer at another plantation on the island, and you get that quite a bit. And you think, yeah, that's Denby. This isn't all of Denby. This is what we might call the money shot. This is just where the focus for money, spend, income generation, and where you're going to focus your resources on. This is Denby. And if you look at there at the bottom where you've got the field systems, that's Denby. With most plantations, only 30% of any plantation was ever cultivated for cane. The land you just couldn't do it. It's just too stony. The soil was too poor, and just too mountainous. But it is really, and these boundaries are so important, because when they first moved over to Jamaica and started taking a lot, especially when Charles II came to the throne in 1660, he was handing out very cheap land grants, like sweets, and so those who were there early were just grabbing them all. Small landowners didn't stand a chance. They were like pac-men, They were just eating away as much as they possibly could. But you think, okay, that's great, you can own your land. So does that mean you didn't get the sorts of disputes that we had with enclosures as we do in this country? They were fighting like rats in a sack all the time. And they would be best chums in their clubs in London while being hugely litigious with each other outside of it. Some of their agents were also small landowners themselves, and they would be in litigation against their own agents regarding a small parcel of land, while still working very, very harmoniously with them in the management of the estate. It was it's life, Jim, but not as we know it. Very bizarre way. And there was a Jamaica Assembly that used English common law, but they adapted it for local purposes. And so you would fight your case in the Jamaica Assembly. But who controlled the law? It is basically you. The planters controlled the Jamaican Assembly, or their brothers or their cousins. And so it was almost impossible to get things done. And so they would come to the English courts. And we see in the pennant letters, they're arguing. They go to the Courts of Chancery, King's Bench, Common Pleas, the Exchequer, House of Lords, both courts of the ecclesiastical courts. It is really unbelievable. They would fight that because they were so rich. It is basically, they were just playing around. But it is amazing. And it also shows just how closely the economy of Jamaica was tied to Britain at that time. And no matter how much you look, they just fought with each other all the time. And this was considered to be a bonanza for corrupt lawyers and corrupt and inadequate surveyors. So much so, and so were the costs of these continuous surveys to establish land ownership, that one of the plantation owners said this of one of the surveyors: evil-minded surveyors concerned only for their own lucre. Now, I'd like to remind you that this was owned by a man this was written by a man who owned enslaved people and who were worked to death so that he could be incredibly rich. And just an example of that is here. This is of, again, pennants, but you can see this one is lovely. Now, this does show variation of time, but not through how the map is done. A lot of information on maps. You can see how they've been broken down. It's who owned what pocket of land over the years, because they would argue. You see arguments going down generations, over a couple of hundred years between generations. And so that's why maps like this that show ownership is really, really important. Can you see in the middle you've got a red line and a blue line? Right. That line, the red line, was the original line where land ownership was established. But from the very beginning, both sides of the map had been working to the blue line. And as you can see, it's basically the same amount of land. It's just shifted a couple of feet. The amount of litigation that was going on, and they were both working very happily to the blue line, but while fighting, I said, like rats in a sack over the red line. And in the end, it was the surveyor himself, instead of wanting to make lots and lots of money out of this, who was saying, will you two just stop it? I'm sure he wanted to bang their hands together and say, will you just get on with it? And will you please accept the blue line now? And please, can we stop this? So who were the surveyors? Well, in Jamaica, we know pretty well who they are. A lot of them were recorded. And I love this image here. This is not from Jamaica. This is from Panama, when they were planning the Panama Railway. And now, I don't know, you can see there's two surveyors there. One is hidden by some of the leaves, some of the foliage, but there's two surveyors there in their sharp suits. And now, I don't know what the illustrator had against surveyors, but if you have a look above the surveyor, there's a monkey about to drop a coconut on one of their heads. And you can see on the left here, the surveyor's assistant is holding the ranging rod, clearly a black man, probably by the looks of him wearing some kind of unbleached linen trousers. Is he enslaved or is he not enslaved? They started surveying the Panama Canal around about 1848. Panama didn't end slavery until 1851. And so there's a 3-year gap where this work would have taken place. So he may well have been enslaved, but we don't actually know, because Panama had one of the largest settlements of what were called free blacks in the area, and we do know that they took paid jobs during the surveying of the railway. So I've no idea whether he's an enslaved man or whether he was paid. But the surveyors were actually, because of the problems they were having with surveyors, they set up an apprenticeship where young surveyors would have to gain 5 years' experience as an apprentice in the Caribbean, because most of them had been previously trained in the UK. And there's a massive difference surveying in Bedfordshire, Hampshire, Surrey, than in conditions like this. And also to try to get a fixed rate for some of the prices that they were charging. And so we have maps like this. But not every map like this was produced by a survey. Most of them were not. And it was really interesting listening to Yuan talking about his notebooks this morning, because most of the maps were produced not from surveys, but from previous maps and previous surveyors' notebooks. There was a massive, massive demand for previous surveyors' notebooks. And James Robertson, who I mentioned earlier, he used to go around buying up as many surveyors' books as he possibly could, so that other surveyors would have to go to him and pay him for access to these things. So cartographers and the surveyors themselves would use old maps, they'd use surveyors' notebooks, they'd use patents, they would use whatever they could to save themselves having to go out and produce. So you do get faults being repeated sometimes, and so sometimes you need a new map to actually correct some of those details. Now, if you're looking at it purely as an object, the vast majority of the paper these maps were produced on were made in Britain, on British paper. Any ink, any black is typically India ink, and any colour is typically watercolour. But an interesting thing, when you look at this, the field systems have been pretty accurate because they needed to know what they needed to control. It was only the borders that breathed somewhat. But also when you look at the buildings, the locations were pretty accurate, but not the way that they've produced them. We do have, at this period, plans of buildings, but most of the buildings, especially on a map like this, would be put into relief, like you can see here. So you can see them side on rather than top down. And they're absolutely, of course, not drawn to scale. You don't get that as a constant until you move into the 19th century. But no matter what your map actually looked like, every single plantation, because these were money-making machines, they had to struggle with their topographical features, of course, but every single one of them would have a hierarchy of land use that was identical. And this was the way that they could manage their resources to get as much as they possibly could out of the land. And so in the middle, right in the middle, you got that money-making machine. There was the great house, the works, and the workers' village. And you can see it here at Pennant. Then you get the main crops, because you needed the workers really close to there. Then you've got the food crops. This is what the estate provided: plantains, potatoes, yams. And then you've got pastures. And then beyond that, you've got provision grounds. I'm coming back to provision grounds in a moment. And then you've got woodland. Now, what's provision land, if you're not familiar with what provision land is, provision land, every owner of enslaved people had to provide them with food. Mostly they provided them with subsistence food, but then they were given a plot of land in which they could grow their own vegetables. But look where it is. It's barren scrubland. And so they were given the worst possible land. If it was possible to grow cane on that land, it would not have been provision grounds. And yet it's through that land that really opened up a whole new opportunity for the enslaved to generate lives of their own. With the women especially, they produced surplus crops that they would start Sunday markets. And the very famous markets in Jamaica were typically started by the women. And it gave them independence, and it gave them some dignity, and it gave them an opportunity to actually earn some money. The communities in Jamaica were never started by the whites. The communities were all settled by the blacks. It was them who formed the communities. And you see that in the strength of the Jamaica women that we have around us today. The provision ground system was not a benevolence from the slave owners. It was a legal obligation. And it was women like these who actually, found some autonomy and some community in setting up these markets. So from that small patch of land, so much has grown out of. And to have that grow out of was one of the most brutal and dehumanizing system is really quite something, and it shows the strength of the people that survived. And so what else can we find out about the people who worked on these communities when we look at the map? So I want to look at the inner circle. And here we have the workers' village here. So what were these houses actually like? These are all rectangle. There are plenty of estates that had round huts. It varied, about 50-50, whether they were round or rectangle. They had to be built themselves. The estate would provide the first lot of materials, but not all the materials. They were expected to fetch brush and that to make the roofs. The top one is 1707 Barbados. The bottom one is a modern reconstruction. So this is what they might totally look like. If they started wearing down, the enslaved themselves were responsible for their wear and tear. But if something like a storm, hurricane, lots of hurricanes, they would be given new material. But other than that, their lives are rarely recorded. If it's not to do with the finances of the estate, they are empty in the record. And so we don't know about the Sunday markets from the plantation records. We need context from other sources to learn about those. And so we know a heck of a lot about where they worked, because this is where the money came from. And just looking at Denby now, very complex. These were cities in their own right. And I'm just checking time. So you've got a complex division of labour. So these here, the field gang, they'd have been in Circle 2. They're working the crops. And those over there are in Circle 1. That's where the skilled workers were. And they would have needed one heck of a lot of buildings to work with. And so within the works that you see at the top there, you've got buildings such as, you've got boiler house, curing house, distillery, cooperage, blacksmiths, joinery shop. But we don't know, we can guess which one some of them are, but we don't know which one, because if you just read the table, I know the text isn't really readable there. All it says is about the works. It doesn't actually tell you what they are, but they needed a heck of a lot of power. You needed to cut the cane quickly. Juice goes off, sugar juice goes off. You need to crush it straight away. Once you crush it to extract the juice, it goes off even quicker. So you need to cut, crush and boil straight away. That's why those systems are all there together. So what evidence do we have of power? Well, if you have a look at the top, you have a windmill there. And windmills were very, very much used on the plantations of Jamaica. And this is another Antiguan painting here. But you can see the style was very, very similar there. Wind was not very reliable, though, not always consistent. You had massive problems with hurricanes. So most plantations would have two forms of crushing power, and we see it here because those are sunshades from animal whims, and the animals would typically be oxen, horses, or cattle. There was a hierarchy of power, which is water was the preferred one. No evidence on Penrhyn of water power, and wind second, and animal third. And you can see it there. And there are the remains of those crushes at Denby. When I visited, I bumped into Hubert here. Hubert was a local teacher. And I was chatting to him, and he said, well, there are the remains of the old plantation here if you want to see them. So after he'd brought me back to consciousness, he showed me where they were. So that is one of the crushes. And I took the shot from further back, you can actually see the curve of the whim around it where the animal would have trodden to work that. And then the cane, of course, taken straight to the boiler house. And again, Antiguan painting showing it far cleaner and less arduous than it otherwise was. Under those massive cauldrons, they would have been burning fires. As a fuel, they used bagasse. They would have dried after the cane had been crushed, the fibres left would be dried, and that was bagasse, and that's what they used to work the fire there. That was fed from the outside, and we have the remains of the boiler house there with Hubert there showing me. It's only the bottom level of the original boiler house there. But what about water power? But you need cane, sugar cane is very, very thirsty. And many plantations would have these huge aqueducts here. This is the aqueduct just outside of Kingston for Papine, Mona, and Hope plantations. They were absolutely enormous, and yet they're hardly recorded on any maps at all. And they were incredible features. Look at this one here. It's just amazing. This is of Trinity Plantation, not a Penrhyn one, but it doesn't appear on many of Trinity's maps at all. You know, considering the wealth that's attached to it, you know, the amount of money that would have cost, it's quite surprising how invisible water features can actually be, especially it was so important for the growing of sugarcane. And once it got the plantations, then it would be used by water wheel to transfer it into motive power to work the crushers. This is on Flint, which is in the north of the island. A lot of Welsh names in Jamaica. So what about water power? We do get water power, but not in the same levels that we've seen on the others. Pennant plantations up in the mountains, of course, had loads of water. We have the two rivers there. We've got this map here it's west at the top, so north is that way, so it's on its side. So we've got River Mino, we've got Thomas River there, but we also have a gully. Gullies were natural rivulet streams that would run through some estates. They took advantage and they worked their field pattern systems around that. They've also, you can't see them clearly on the map without zooming in, you also have what they call gutters. And gutters were produced by the estates itself, and this was to carry water between the rivers, small canals, I suppose, that were used for irrigation purposes. None whatsoever on Denby. But I do know that afterward, because Denby was purely dependent upon rainwater, and it was frequently dry. The records show this. A water wheel was put in later. This is one that the Jamaica Heritage Trust has put in as a replica. I don't know how accurate it was, but I know that the Muirheads who leased Denby from the Pennants actually said that they wanted a reduced lease from the Pennant so they could put in an adequate irrigation system. And so that's what you see here. So I presume that came about through that. And so I just want to pull things together now. We've looked at Jamaica from the 18th century maps. What do they actually tell us about the landscape? And what has been the impact of relentless agricultural extraction on the land? Sugar is renowned for just leaching nutrients out of the ground if it's not if it's not fertilised properly. They did try fertilise, but there was no rest for the land. They didn't try to do the 3-fuel system or anything like that. It was just cropping continuously. So let's fast forward a bit and have a look at Denbigh. What's there now? Just closing up here. Just a few things for you to note. If you follow a line now across the top of the formal field system, and there is a ford that crosses the river and comes down there. And also take note of the field system patterns and also where the workers' village is there, and of course the curve of the River Mino. Because when we go on to Google Earth, there it is. And you can see the road at the top of the plantation maps is coming there. The ford, there's a bridge there now. And you can see the field systems marked there. And where the enslaved village was, people still live there. It's still settled. It's still people's homes. I find that quite powerful. And what an example of how sugarcane leaches the ground. There is nothing there. There is nothing there. And I stood on where the ford was, where the bridge is. So that is Denbigh on that side, and this is Coates on this side. And the same, it's very different when we get up to the mountains, to Pennant. So this is Pennant, so you can see there's a big curve there and the big M there. When we go into Google Earth, you can see it there, the big curve there and the big M there. But what of the ground itself? It looks a lot greener, and it is because it's been better looked after. And so here we have, I'm actually standing on the site of the Great House now, on the hill, looking down. After enslavement, it was taken over, broken up, multiple ownerships, growing different types of crops. They grow banana, coffee, even sugarcane, but a whole variety of different crops there, which means that the land is far more fertile, far better looked after. And so I'm standing on top where the Great House is there, looking down, and it looks as if this is actually on the site of the old works. And this is the last map I want to show you. It's a Pennant map, but it's not a map of Jamaica. It's a map of Penrhyn Quarry in North Wales. The Pennants, of course, invested their huge amount of Jamaica money into the North Wales slate industry. And unlike other slate quarry owners in the area, they moved very quickly. They invested very sharply. They established their extraction process, their management of large groups of people, their transport infrastructure, their export routes, their trading links, all very quickly. Whereas for other owners of slate quarries, it took them a lot longer, and they were trialing things for the first time. But we have to remember that for the Pennants, they had been working industrial systems for 100 years before they even got to North Wales. And that is something that we frequently forget. We cannot understand the establishment of Penrhyn Quarry without understanding Jamaica, because it enabled them to move forward so much quicker than anywhere else, and the others in the area, enabling Penrhyn Quarry to, of course, become one of the largest slate quarries of its time. Now, as I say, with Bangor University Archives, they've had this wonderful grant from the Welsh Government to digitise these images, and they are all freely available. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them are freely available online. And we've been building our understanding of empire for many years through the work of many people. And the broader picture gives us an understanding of the why, the where, the what. But what these maps, these collections give us is the how. How were these plantations managed? How did empire work literally at grassroots level? And these maps actually show us that. And the Pennant collection, I just think they're not just a record of property. They are witnesses to enslavement, resource exploitation, and the ruthless form of land grabbing. They are not value free. And I think they are, and I think we need to appreciate this context when we look at our understanding of Wales's role in empire. And please, if you could, in relation to the potential closing of Bangor University Archives, their staff has been cut by 75%, leaving just one person there. Please, at one part-time role, please, could I ask you to please go to change.org and sign a petition asking for the university to reconsider this decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marian. That was a fantastic talk, and yeah, it's really interesting to see with those maps, and you know, reappoint that you said before, how harrowing those maps are, that they may look like things of beauty, but the stories behind them are absolutely terrible. I think we've got time for a few questions before we move on to our next speaker. There are mics upstairs as well as downstairs, so I'll open her up. Does anyone like to ask a question to Marian? Or an observation? No? I'll ask a question, that's all right then.
There's a couple up there.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Marian. That's really interesting. I've been following your work a long time, but to see it all put together there, it's really good. I wondered about reparative justice. A lot of British family estates are visiting the Caribbean and maybe not doing it through official policy, but individually. Would there be anything like that with the Pennant family? And I wondered also about the Jamaican Heritage Trust and what's the appetite in Jamaica for dealing with, presenting, interpreting some of this history, because that must be quite difficult.
Oh, so many really good questions there. Let's do them backwards, and if I forget to answer one, please give me a nudge. The Jamaica Heritage Trust, as you can imagine, for years, the Jamaica, they have looked at their history from great survivors. They are victors. They fought against slavery and they won. And I've been round, I was very lucky to get a research grant to spend some time in Jamaica. And I visited a lot of schools in the area, and seeing how they interpret their history. And they all have what they call a history table. And they've got, you know, Nanny of the Maroons, Shams Sharp. They do it through their heroes. And so they never see themselves as victims. And in Jamaica, it's all about being smaddy, which is somebody, and it's smaddiness, and so you get that confidence. You know, in many ways, Jamaica is a confidence and certainly a sports superpower, you know, in its own right. There's been a changeover. I spent some time with the Jamaica Heritage Trust, and they were very honest, and they were saying certainly for many years, they didn't really want to touch the old plantation story for many reasons. But recently they decided, because of course it does bring in money, a lot of, and tourism. Some of the, like for example, Rose Hall, if any of you have been to Jamaica, Rose Hall was a ruin. They've done it up, gets a lot of tourism, a lot of money coming in, but it's owned by an American. And so Jamaica said, well, we might as well own our history, understand our history, and make some money from tourism into the area. It's a perfectly understandable thing. But when I was there, they were having a lot of debate about what to call things. And say, for example, the Great House caused a lot of problems. Because can they really call it a Great House? They can't call it a plantation house because there's so many other buildings on the site. But it's really interesting that, because I was like, what can we do? What can we do to help you? What can we do to help you? And the big one was that their records, Jamaica, the collections they have in Jamaica Archives is absolutely fantastic. It really is good. But you can't open some of them because they're just so delicate. You know, the conditions, they've got a lot of, the weathering has got to them, bugs have got to them. Some of the pennant scrolls you just can't open, you know, otherwise they will just crumble. And so most of the good quality stuff is in Europe. And so what they said, please digitize them so that our students can access that, so our communities can access that. So we're in the process of doing it, and the Bangor Uni wants to close it down. Right, regarding the pennants, now of course I'm not here to speak for the pennants. And so there's no weight in what I say. It is a really, as you can imagine, traumatic problem. Regarding the reparations takes many forms, including education. And when I was part of a group that brought the Jamaican High Commissioner to Bangor to look at the papers a couple of years ago. And he actually, because the papers have been with Bangor University Archive since 1939. And so they're one of the first archives that have been given over for public access. So the High Commissioner thanked them for allowing public access to, you know, such other people, other families, I assure you, have burnt theirs, or they're not letting anybody have a look in. So there's public access. The Pennant family have funded repairs to the schools in Pennants, plus other forms through a trust. There's plenty more that could be said about this, but I don't think this is the right venue for it. There is CARICOM, the community of Caribbean islands. They are working with landed estate owners for reparations, and there's some good work being carried out through that. But some really good questions. Thank you.
And then one more question. So is it you, Anne?
No, there was several that I
Okay. Is there any more questions online? I'm quite keen to, if there is any. No?
I think this gentleman had a question.
Oh, sorry.
This may seem a silly question after talking about slavery, but you mentioned that some of the lines on the maps are straight and they were drawn with a ruler. How confident are you that the drawing from Panama is the sort of survey they were engaged in? Because in the Panama, they're using some sort of theodolite. I suspect that they're just using a trough compass and measuring off, to use the old phrase, with a chain.
You are absolutely right. The reason why I used the Panama map, because that is the only illustration I could find of a surveyor of that period.
Okay. Well, if we could say thank you again to Marian, and we'll move on with the next speaker. Thank you, Marian.
Thank you.